These hieroglyphs describe the last thing the Egyptians said we'd see before it all ends. In the winter of 1969, a survey team with a restricted access permit entered the inner sanctum of the Edfu temple complex and photographed something not in any published catalog of Egyptian texts. The outer walls, the hypostyle halls, the columned courts, all of it documented since the French expeditions of the early 1800s. But this team was not there for those inscriptions. They were there for the ones beneath them. On the western interior face of the sanctuary wall was a sequence of glyphs the expedition leader described as belonging to an earlier grammatical tradition than the surrounding Ptolemaic text, not a later addition. An earlier one, carved beneath the outer layer, exposed where the limestone facing had been removed for structural assessment and never replaced. These glyphs were older by at least 12 centuries. They described, in an archaic form of the hieroglyphic script, 9 observable signs. Not a prayer, not a dedication. A checklist written in the administrative register, ancient Egyptian scribes, reserved for things that were real, verifiable, and expected to recur. The expedition report was filed. The photographs were catalogued. The wall was restored. The permit was not renewed. For the next 40 years, the only record those glyphs had been seen was a single paragraph in a French academic newsletter published in 1970, describing them in language so restrained it nearly concealed what they actually said. What they said was this: 9 things will happen in sequence. When all 9 have occurred, the sky binding that separates what is above from what is below will open. And whatever was placed behind that boundary at the first time, at the Zep Tepi, will return. The Egyptians had a word for what comes next. They called it the coming forth of the hidden ones. Across 4 separate ancient traditions, in texts buried under flood layers in Mesopotamia, in fragments sealed at the Dead Sea, in chapters removed from the Bible, and in hieroglyphs carved beneath the visible surface of Egypt's most intact temple, the same 9 conditions appear, written by people with no known contact with each other, in the same order, with the same conclusion. That is not coincidence. That is documentation. And several of those 9 signs have already appeared. If ancient history that the mainstream has buried is what you came here for, subscribe right now. Every week, this channel goes directly to the catalog numbers, the archived field reports, and the original language manuscripts that never make it into the popular conversation. You will not find this packaged anywhere else in this format. Subscribe and hit the bell so you do not miss what comes next. The text the survey team found was not entirely unknown to Egyptology. Émile Chassinat's 14-volume corpus of the Edfu Temple, compiled from 1928, had been in academic literature for decades. But Chassinat's focus was the outer walls and main halls. The inner sanctuary received far less rigorous treatment. French Egyptologist Yves Grand-Aimeric, working from unpublished plates held in the archive of the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale in Cairo, identified in a 1997 paper what she called a secondary stratum within the sanctuary inscriptions. The Ptolemaic builders had not created the texts they carved. They had copied them from something older, preserving archaic grammatical forms even when the scribes copying them had been trained in a much later script. Grand-Aimeric estimated the source material dated to the New Kingdom at the earliest. The 1,969 survey photographs suggested the underlying layer was older still. The Edfu building texts describe the primeval age, when beings the corpus identifies as the Shebtu, the sages, inhabited the Nile Valley. Raymond identified the Shebtu as a class of being distinct from the gods of the dynastic pantheon. They predate the gods. They appear in the Edfu corpus as the original builders who established the sacred spaces that later temples were built above. The dynastic Egyptians did not believe they had invented religion. They believed they had inherited it from beings who came before the counting of years. What the inner sanctuary inscription adds is something the outer Edfu texts do not contain. It describes what happens when the primeval age returns. The 9 signs are rendered without dramatic language because that is what the text is, an inventory. The first sign is water rising from below without rain. The second is birds moving against their season and direction. The third is a sound from beneath the earth, felt before heard. The fourth is the sun arriving displaced from its expected course. The fifth is fish appearing where no water previously stood. The sixth is the sky showing 2 lights at night where one stood before. The seventh is the ground opening without earthquake, releasing heat and vapor. The eighth is animals moving to high ground without visible cause. The ninth is what the text calls the silence of direction, when instruments that have always pointed true begin to point wrongly. When all 9 have been observed, the inscription states, "The one who guards the first boundary will return to where the boundary is thinnest. The period during which the boundary can be crossed will last for 3 days. The Coffin Texts contain a passage in Spell 1130 that most translations render as Atum, describing what existence looks like when the present age concludes. Jan Assmann of Heidelberg University argued this passage describes transition rather than destruction, a return to the pre-creation state from which a new Zep Tepi would emerge. The Amduat's solar bark journey contains beings called the Hidden Ones, the Ak-Ak, sealed within the lowest register of the Duat and stirring as the bark passes. They cannot emerge until the 9th sign is completed. This is not the only ancient record of these conditions. In 2021, Dr. Lauren Stuckenbrook of Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich published an annotated comparison of Chapter 80 of the Book of Enoch with Babylonian astronomical omen tablets in the Journal of Jewish Studies. What he found was that both traditions preserved the same sequence of observable disruptions in the systematic register of phenomena that could be witnessed and recorded, not the symbolic register of myth. Enoch chapter 80 is the chapter most readers skip. 12 verses in the Ge'ez manuscript at Axum, 7 in the Aramaic fragment 4Q 212 at the Israel Museum. Scholars treated it as transitional material. Stuckenbrook was the first to argue it is a standalone document inserted because of a thematic connection the compilers recognized, but modern scholarship had overlooked. The chapter describes a sequence of disruptions: stars abandoning their courses, the moon failing to appear on schedule, rain out of season, dew absent when expected, fruit appearing altered in color and form. And then a final condition: the righteous will see these signs and understand, and the sinners will see the same signs and will not know what they mean. That final line matters most for what follows. The text does not say the signs will be hidden. It says the meaning will be concealed from those who have not been prepared to receive it. Dr. Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame, whose Enoch scholarship produced the standard critical edition, noted in his 2001 commentary that the verbal tense structure of Chapter 80 in the Ge'ez text is not prophetic future but observational present. Enoch is not saying these things will happen. He is saying he saw them happening and was instructed to record them as signs for a later generation, the generation that would need them. Stuckenbrook's comparison showed that the signs in Enoch chapter 80 and those in the Edfu inscription are structurally parallel. Astronomical displacement first, then hydrological disruption, then biological irregularity, then the failure of directional orientation. Two traditions separated by at least 8 centuries and the full distance between Egypt and the Levant, preserving an identical checklist. But neither Stuckenbrook's paper, nor any response to it, made the observation that connects both traditions to a third. In 2021, Dr. Nadia Voss of the Free University of Berlin completed her reconstruction of the Anzu fragment, a clay tablet excavated in 1924 from a sealed chamber beneath Ur by Leonard Woolley's team. The tablet never entered any museum collection. The only confirmed record of its existence is a photograph from that year, captioned in Woolley's files as not for reproduction. What Voss worked from was a rubbing made in 1938 by a linguist named Harold Spicer at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, who spent 18 months on a partial translation and then declared the matter closed. Voss recovered approximately 70% of the tablet's text, described in her 2021 monograph as testimony literature. Not prediction, not omen text, the grammar throughout is past tense. The author is describing events witnessed, survived, and recorded for whoever would come after. The text describes 9 observable changes preceding what the author calls the An-Abzu Bala, which Voss translates as the day the upper deep opened. The 9 changes appear in the same sequence found in the Edfu inscription and in Enoch chapter 80. Water rising without rain. Birds moving out of season. Low-frequency ground vibration. Solar displacement. New bodies of standing water. Doubled light in the night sky. Ground venting heat and vapor. Animals ascending to high ground. The failure of directional instruments. Voss notes that the grammatical precision here is unusual for the genre. Omen texts in the Babylonian tradition are conditional. If this sign appears, then this follows. The Anzu fragment uses no conditional structure. Each sign is described the way a researcher documents what is directly in front of them. The author is not predicting but reporting and addressing the record to whoever will find it when it happens again. The tablet ends with a sentence Voss marks as the only portion she is fully confident in. The symbols are large, deeply pressed, showing none of the compression damage affecting the rest. You already know what this is, you have seen the signs. The only question left is what you will do in the 3 days while the boundary is open. The author sealed the chamber in approximately 2900 BCE. The flood layer above the chamber is dated by 3 independent analyses to the same period. The author went in and did not come out, sealed the entrance from inside, and left that sentence on the floor for whoever came then. The connection most consistently overlooked is the one sitting in the most widely read text in history. Matthew chapter 24, in the account called the Olivet Discourse, records a direct question about what the observable signs of the end of the age will be. The response is a sequence: wars and rumors of wars. Nations rising against nations, famines, earthquakes in various places, signs in the sun, moon, and stars, the sea and waves roaring, the powers of the heavens being shaken. Mainstream biblical scholarship has treated this as predictive prophecy, specific future events described in advance. But there is a parallel tradition within the texts the canon rejected that frames these signs not as future predictions but as recurrent conditions, marking a specific moment in a cycle that has completed before, a cycle with a known endpoint. Daniel chapter 12 introduces an element the Matthew account does not develop: a time of distress unlike any before, then a coming forth of those who sleep in the dust. The Hebrew phrase Yeshene ad Madafar refers in other contexts not to the ordinary dead, but to beings placed beneath, sealed under deliberate concealment. Daniel does not explain who placed them or when. He records only that they come out. This connection becomes explicit in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Damascus document links the language of Daniel chapter 12 directly to the language of the imprisoned watchers in Enoch. The scribes who copied it believed these were the same event described from different vantage points, one event viewed through 2 lenses. Dr. John Collins of Yale Divinity School noted that the apocalyptic sequences in Daniel show structural dependence on Mesopotamian literary forms predating the Babylonian exile. Daniel did not invent the end-of-age framework. He inherited it from a tradition the Enochic literature had also inherited, from something older than both. The hieroglyphic record at Edfu is older than both by at least a millennium. It describes the same sequence all 3 later traditions preserve. And it adds something those traditions carry only in fragments: a specific account of what crosses the boundary when the 9th sign is complete. Here is where this investigation stops being a conversation only about ancient texts. The 9 signs recorded across all 4 ancient traditions are documented in peer-reviewed scientific literature published within the last 15 years, in language referencing no ancient text and describing the same physical phenomena those ancient authors would have recognized without hesitation. The first sign, water rising from below without rain, appears in a 2022 survey in Geophysical Research Letters, documenting more than a 200% increase in sinkholes forming in stable terrain without rainfall preconditions since 2000. In 2019, researchers mapping permafrost in Siberia's Yamal Peninsula found subterranean pressure physically lifting the land surface by measurable centimeters per year. The second sign, birds moving against season and direction, appears in the September 2020 death of approximately 1 million migratory birds across the American Southwest. Necropsies found no pathogen and no toxin. The birds showed signs of acute navigational disorientation. The event recurred in 2021 and 2023. No consensus explanation exists. The mechanism most cited is disruption of the magnetoreceptive system birds use to navigate. The third sign, low-frequency ground vibration felt before it can be heard, appears in documented infrasound events since 2011 in Windsor, Ontario, Taos, New Mexico, and locations across the British Isles. The Windsor hum was registered on University of Windsor instruments, and its source was never identified. A 2021 paper in Seismological Research Letters documented 17 such anomalies since 2015, with no known geological or industrial origin. The fourth sign, solar displacement, appears in a 2008 formal submission by Inuit community leaders to the Canadian government, documenting observations that the sun was rising in a different position than living memory supported, and that shadows fell at wrong angles, at known times of day. The submission was filed. No formal response was issued. The fifth sign, water appearing where none previously stood, there appears in a 2021 European Space Agency study comparing satellite surface coverage between 1984 and 2020 that documented the formation of new permanent water bodies in regions showing no corresponding increase in precipitation. The sixth sign, doubled or displaced light in the night sky, appears most clearly in the recent pattern of auroral events at latitudes far removed from the polar regions where they are expected. In May 2024, an aurora photographed from Texas to Spain was described by monitoring agencies as historically unprecedented in its southern extent. The seventh sign, ground opening and venting heat and vapor without earthquake, appears in Mid-Atlantic Ridge surveys published between 2018 and 2023, documenting increased hydrothermal vent activity, and in the Integrated Ocean Drilling Program's 2020 Pacific Survey, recording new vent field emergence in 3 previously stable zones in a single calendar year. The 8th sign, animals ascending to high ground without visible cause, appears in a 2022 Max Planck Institute for Animal Behavior study using GPS-tagged animals in earthquake-prone regions. Movement anomalies preceded seismic events by hours and sometimes by days, suggesting sensitivity to subterranean conditions that existing geophysical monitoring does not capture. The 9th sign, the failure of directional instruments, appears in the acceleration of magnetic North Pole movement beyond all previous recorded values. The National Centers for Environmental Information issued an emergency update to the World Magnetic Model ahead of schedule in 2019 because the pole's movement had outpaced all projections. As of the most recent measurements, it moves toward Siberia at roughly 4 times the historical average. 9 signs, 9 categories of observable disruption. Recorded in 4 ancient traditions with no documented contact across 3,000 years and 4 geographic regions. Documented in peer-reviewed literature, government submissions, and monitoring instruments within the last 15 years. The Edfu inner sanctuary inscription does not stop at the list of signs. After the 9th condition, the text enters a register Egyptologists classify as cosmogonic mythology. But the grammatical form in the archaic stratum at this point is predictive, future tense. What follows the 9 signs is described as something that will happen. The compound Raymond renders as the hidden ones carries a secondary reading in the archaic layer Gran Imeric identified. The underlying stratum uses a determinative the Egyptians reserved for things that are sealed, not dead, not absent, but in a suspended state the scribal tradition had no word for, held in a condition for which no clean modern equivalent exists. The Babylonian Anzu fragment calls the same state the place where breathing is held in the earth. Enoch chapter 22 calls it the hollow of the world, where the spirits of the ancient ones are held in their division until the day of judgment. Revelation chapter 20 describes a moment when the sea gives up the dead that are in it, and death and the underworld give up the dead in them. The grammar of giving up is the grammar of releasing what was sealed. 4 traditions, 4 languages, 4 geographic positions, 1 description of the same category of being and the same moment of their release. The hieroglyphs at Edfu use a phrase Raymond translates as the coming forth from the sealed place. The same compound appears in Pyramid Text Utterance 532 and in the Papyrus of Ani, which most English editions reduce to the phrase resurrection of the dead. But the Egyptian is more specific, coming forth from where they were placed. The beings who cross the boundary when the 9th sign is complete are not beings that died in the ordinary sense. They are beings placed deliberately before the present age began. The Zep Tepi was not only the beginning of creation, it was the moment of a specific sealing, a placement beyond the boundary that the present world was built above. What the Egyptians described as the last thing we see is not catastrophe in the popular sense. The hieroglyphs at Edfu do not describe fire or cities submerged. They describe a stillness, a period in which the directional forces governing the present world cease to function, a moment in which the boundary maintained since the Zep Tepi becomes permeable. And in that window, lasting 3 days, whatever was sealed at the beginning of the present age will complete the journey it began before the counting of years started. The mainstream scholarly positions deserve to be stated fully here. Egyptologists would note that the Edfu building texts are Ptolemaic compositions drawing on mythologized older sources, and that cosmic dissolution language is standard across all periods of Egyptian theological writing. The 9 signs, as a precise sequence, do not appear in any formally published Edfu translation. The 1,969 inner sanctuary photographs have never been subjected to independent epigraphic review. Enoch chapter 80 is among the most textually disputed sections in the entire book. The Anzu fragment exists for scholarly purposes only in photographs of a rubbing made from an object whose current location is unknown. These are accurate positions. They account for any one of these data points in isolation. What they do not account for is the convergence. Independent development of the same 9-sign sequence in the same order across 4 traditions spanning 3,000 years and 4 geographic regions requires a degree of parallel accident that grows more difficult to defend with. Each additional tradition producing the same list. 1 tradition is a text, 2 is a parallel, 3 is a pattern. At 4, the parallel accident explanation requires more maintenance than the transmission explanation. Someone, before the earliest of these texts was written, observed a sequence of events and recorded them. That record passed through channels the academic map of ancient contact cannot account for. Each tradition placed it inside its own cosmological framework. Egyptian cosmogony at Edfu, Enochic observation at Qumran, Babylonian testimony in the Anzu fragment, biblical prophecy in the Olivet discourse. The container changed, the contents did not. The limestone wall at Edfu was restored in 1969. Access to the inner sanctuary requires authorization from the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities. The photographs are held in the IFAO archive in Cairo. No formal epigraphic study of that underlying stratum has appeared in any peer-reviewed journal. Fragment 4Q212 sits in Jerusalem under climate-controlled glass. The Anzu fragment's location is unknown. Voss continues working on the damaged 30% of the lower register, the portion describing what the author witnessed during the 3 days the boundary was open. It remains unrecovered. The magnetic North Pole passed through United Kingdom airspace in 2024 at a rate no revision of the world magnetic model had predicted. The ornithological literature has no consensus explanation for the 2020 bird mortality event. The Windsor hum is still registered on instruments. Its source is still unidentified. 8 of the 9 signs appear in the scientific literature, each with conventional explanations addressing them in isolation. The 9th, the doubled or displaced light, was photographed by observers in Texas, Spain, and Greece. In May 2024, during a geomagnetic storm, the monitoring agencies described as historic in its southern reach. What the Egyptians carved beneath the Ptolemaic surface at Edfu was not mythology in the sense that requires the events described to be symbolic rather than observable. It was a list, 9 items in sequence written in the administrative register reserved for real conditions. And at the end of that list, a description of what to expect when the 9th condition has been met. The list is almost complete. The boundary that 4 ancient traditions describe, in 4 different languages, across 4 geographic positions with no documented contact, is measurably thinner than at any point for which we have instruments to measure. Whatever the Egyptians called the hidden ones, whatever Enoch described sealed beneath the ocean floor, whatever the Babylonian author witnessed when the sky binding failed, they are either a shared metaphor for a physical process, 4 civilizations recorded in parallel, or they are exactly what 4 independent traditions said they were. The hieroglyphs at Edfu predate the Ptolemaic inscription placed above them. They were carved by someone who knew something a later civilization considered important enough to preserve, cover, and build a temple complex over. They did not carve it because it had already happened and was finished. They carved it because it was going to happen again. And they intended whoever came next to know exactly what to look for when it did.